She stepped off the train with a small suitcase, a heart full of hope, only to be rejected by the man she was supposed to marry right in front of the whole town. Penniless. No one she knew. Nowhere to go. Clara Whitlock was so fragile that people thought she would collapse on the platform. But they were wrong, because the woman who seemed the weakest in everyone's eyes was the only one strong enough to save an entire family from ruin. Please like, comment the city you're watching in so I know how far this story has progressed. And watch until the end, because this is a story you won't want to miss. The train slowed before Clara could prepare herself for what came next. She had rehearsed it a dozen times in her head during the 3-day journey. The moment she stepped onto the platform and Thomas Greer finally saw her in person for the first time. She had imagined it as something simple and decent. A handshake. Maybe an awkward smile. Two people who had written letters to each other for 7 months figuring out how to become real to one another. She had not imagined this. The platform at Harlan's Creek was more crowded than she expected for a town this size. Ranchers waiting on supply deliveries, women collecting parcels, a handful of children chasing each other between the legs of adults who weren't paying attention. Clara stepped down from the rail car carrying a single bag, the leather worn soft at the handles from years of use, and she stood there a moment, letting the crowd sort itself around her while she searched for a face that matched the photograph Thomas had sent. She spotted him before he spotted her. He was taller than she'd expected, broad through the shoulders, the kind of man who had probably never gone a day without eating enough. He was scanning the platform with an expression she couldn't quite read yet, and then his eyes landed on her, and she watched that expression change. It didn't harden exactly. It was more like something inside him simply closed. He walked toward her anyway. She gave him credit for that. "Miss Whitlock," he said. "Mr. Greer." She held out her hand. He shook it once, briefly, the way you'd shake the hand of someone you just met at a church social and were never going to see again. He stepped back before she could say anything else. His eyes moved over her in the way she had spent her whole life learning to recognize. That particular kind of assessment, quick and damning, that started at the face and ended somewhere around the shoulders and made a decision before she'd opened her mouth. "I thought you'd be—" He stopped. "Taller?" she offered. She kept her voice even. "Healthier," he said. He said it like he was being honest instead of cruel, which was somehow worse. "Your letters didn't mention—" He seemed to realize too late that he was already well past any line of decency, so he stopped trying to finish the sentence. "I have a ranch to run, Miss Whitlock. I need a woman who can handle the work, not someone who looks like she's going to fall over in a stiff wind." Clara looked at him for a moment. She had worked in a textile mill for 4 years before her lungs gave out, then spent 2 years keeping house for a widow outside of Pittsburgh who paid her in room and board and a small wage that she'd saved, coin by coin, until she had enough for a train ticket west. She had survived a winter in a boarding house where the pipes froze and the owner cut the coal rations in half, and 3 of the other boarders got sick enough to be taken to hospital. She had survived a summer where the mill work was so relentless that women twice her size were collapsing on the floor. She was thin, yes. She was tired, yes. She was not going to fall over. But she didn't say any of that because she understood immediately that it wouldn't matter. He had already made his decision. She was looking at a man who had written her letters about wanting a capable partner, a woman of good sense and steady character, and who, faced with an actual woman of good sense and steady character who happened to weigh less than he'd expected, had decided that none of it counted. "I understand," she said. The 2 words cost her more than she let show. Thomas Greer nodded once, with something that might have been relief, and then he walked back through the crowd and was gone. Just like that. 3 days on a train and 7 months of letters, and that was how it ended, on a platform in a town she'd never seen before, with 43 cents in her pocket and nowhere to sleep that night. She stood there for a moment with the noise of the platform moving around her. A woman nearby was embracing a man who had just arrived. One of the children who'd been running stopped nearby and stared at Clara with frank curiosity before a woman's hand reached down and steered him away. Clara set her bag down, straightened her back, and looked at the town. Harlan's Creek was bigger than she'd expected and smaller than it wanted to be. A main street running perpendicular to the tracks, 2- and 3-story wooden buildings with ambitious facades, a general store, a land office, 2 saloons, a church set back a little on a side street as if embarrassed by the company it was keeping. Beyond the rooftops, the land opened up into something enormous. Grassland running out toward a low ridge of hills, sky so wide it seemed to be making a point. She picked up her bag and walked off the platform. There was a bench outside the station and she sat on it and tried to think. She had 43 cents. She knew no one in Harlan's Creek. She had no job, no room, no arrangement of any kind. She could ask at one of the saloons whether they needed help in the kitchen. She'd done that kind of work before. But saloon kitchens in frontier towns had a way of leading to expectations she wasn't interested in meeting. She could try the church. She had never much cared for the particular transaction involved in asking a church for help. That performance of humility and gratitude and the careful management of someone else's sense of their own goodness, but it was an option. She was still sitting there, turning the problem over in her mind the way she'd turned over problems her whole life, methodically, without panic, because panic had never once solved anything, when a shadow fell across the bench. "You're the Greer woman," said the man standing over her. He was somewhere past 50, weathered in the way of men who worked outdoors, with a tin star on his vest that explained his confidence in making statements rather than asking questions. "I was going to be," Clara said. "I'm not anymore." "Saw what happened." He said it without particular sympathy or judgment, just noting a fact. "You got somewhere to go?" "I'm working on it." He studied her for a moment. "Name's Alderman, sheriff. I've got a situation that might be of some use to you if you're willing to hear it." She looked up at him. "I'm listening." He sat down on the other end of the bench, not crowding her, which she appreciated. "There's a rancher outside town named Gideon Hale. Lost his wife about 8 months back. He's got 3 children. Oldest is 12, youngest just turned 5. He's managing mostly, but the household is falling apart at the edges and it's going to hurt the children more than him before long." He paused. "He's not looking for another wife. He's been clear about that. What he needs is someone who can hold things together in the house while he keeps the operation running." "What does it pay?" "Room and board," Alderman said. "Meals and a bed. He can't do wages right now, not until after the fall sales." Clara was quiet for a moment. She did the arithmetic of 43 cents against the cost of a single night at the cheapest boarding house in town, whatever that might be, and then against the cost of a train ticket back to anywhere she'd come from, which was money she did not have. "1 meal a day," she said. "Not 3. If the ranch is struggling, I don't want to eat into what the children need. 1 meal, a bed, and a place to work. If the fall sales go well, we can talk about wages then." Alderman looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. "That's not a negotiation most people would make in your favor." "I'm not trying to make it in my favor," she said. "I'm trying to make it workable." He was quiet for a moment, then he stood up. "I'll take you out there this afternoon if you want." "All right," said Clara. She picked up her bag and followed him. The Hale Ranch was 4 miles out of town, down a road that started as packed dirt and gradually became less certain of itself as it went. The sheriff had a wagon and a horse that moved at a pace suggesting the horse had opinions about the whole arrangement. Clara sat beside Alderman and watched the land open up around her. After the compressed gray world of mill towns and boarding house windows, the sheer amount of sky was disorienting. She kept having the sensation that she ought to be able to see a wall somewhere, some edge to things, and there wasn't one. "The children," she said. "What are their names?" "Older boy is Nathan, 12, like I said. Thinks he's already a man and is about 2/3 right about that. Middle girl is May, she's 9. Quiet mostly. Took the mother's death hardest, from what I can tell. Little one is Sam. He's 5 and he doesn't stop moving." "How did their mother die?" "Fever. Came on fast, took her in under 2 weeks. A pause. "Her name was Ruth, in case anyone asks." Clara filed all of this away. "And Mr. Hale. He's a decent man, works hard, doesn't drink too much, doesn't have a temper that gets away from him. He's just—" Alderman searched for the word. "He's not managing to be everywhere at once, and a ranch needs someone everywhere at once." "I understand that," Clara said. They came over a low rise and the ranch spread out below them. A main house, a barn, a smaller outbuilding, a fenced yard with a kitchen garden that had been ambitious in the spring and was now losing its argument with the encroaching weeds. There were cattle visible in the distance, a dozen or so horses in a paddock near the barn. The house itself was solid, well-built, the kind of structure that had been put up by someone who intended to stay. But Alderman was right about the edges. You could see it even from a distance. The slight sag of a gate that needed rehinging, the stack of firewood piled wrong and starting to lean, the kitchen garden losing ground. A man came out of the barn as the wagon pulled into the yard. He was around 40, she guessed, with dark hair going gray at the temples and the particular posture of someone who had been carrying something heavy for so long that it had become part of how he stood. He was not unhandsome. He looked at the wagon, then at Alderman, then at Clara, and she saw the same expression she'd seen on Thomas Greer's face on the platform, that quick involuntary assessment, except this one was followed by something more complicated. He didn't look contemptuous, he just looked uncertain. "Gideon," Alderman said, climbing down. "This is Miss Whitlock. She's in a situation, and you're in a situation, and I thought the two situations might fit together." Gideon Hale looked at her for a moment without speaking. She looked back at him without looking away. She had learned a long time ago that looking away first cost you something you didn't always get back. "How much experience do you have with ranch households?" he asked. "I've run households," she said, "not ranches specifically. I know how to cook, preserve food, manage a kitchen, keep accounts, mend and sew, and I learn fast." "She's asking 1 meal a day and a bed," Alderman said. "No wages until fall." Gideon Hale looked at Alderman like he wasn't sure if he was being made a fool of. Then he looked back at Clara. "Why would you agree to that?" "Because it's what I need right now," she said simply, "and it sounds like it might be what you need." A door banged open somewhere behind Gideon, and feet came pounding down the porch steps. Sam arrived at a dead run, braked hard when he saw the wagon and the stranger on it, and stood there staring at Clara with the completely unguarded curiosity of a 5-year-old who had not yet learned that staring was rude. "Who's that?" he asked. "Miss Whitlock," his father said. "Why is she so skinny?" "Samuel?" "I'm asking because I want to know." "It's all right," Clara said. She looked at Sam directly, which most adults didn't do with small children. "I've been traveling a long time and haven't eaten much. I'd imagine I'll fill out some once I've had a chance to settle." Sam considered this with great seriousness. "We have beans," he offered. "I like beans," Clara said. This seemed to resolve something for him. He turned around and ran back toward the house, apparently satisfied. Gideon Hale watched his youngest son disappear through the door. He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand, a gesture that seemed habitual and had nothing to do with any physical discomfort. He looked at Alderman. He looked at Clara. "You can take the room off the kitchen," he said. "It's small." "That's fine," said Clara. "Okay." The room off the kitchen was small in the way that the description "small" almost didn't cover. It was barely wide enough for the narrow bed and the wooden chest at its foot, with a single window that looked out at the side of the barn. But the mattress was sound, and there were 2 blankets, and the room had a door that closed and latched from the inside, and Clara had slept in worse situations than this. She set her bag on the chest and stood in the middle of the room for a moment, just breathing. Then she went to the kitchen and looked at what she had to work with. The kitchen told her most of what she needed to know about how the household had been running since Ruth Hale died. The staples were there: flour, salt, dried beans, some cornmeal, but they were being used without much system, the way you use things when you were eating to survive rather than planning ahead. There were supplies that had been opened and not properly sealed back and would start to go stale within weeks. The root cellar, when she found it and went down to look, had a reasonable stock: potatoes, some cured pork, a few jars of preserved fruit that Ruth had probably put up before she got sick, but nothing had been added to it, and nothing had been organized. It was what you'd expect from a man keeping children fed in between the demands of running a cattle operation, doing the best he could. It wasn't good enough, but that was what she was here for. She came back up from the root cellar to find May standing in the kitchen doorway. The girl was 9, as Alderman had said, and she had her father's dark coloring and something in her face that was very still, not shy exactly, but watchful, the kind of child who did a lot of looking before she decided anything. "Are you going to be our new mother?" May asked. The question was delivered with absolute neutrality, no hostility and no hope, just a fact she was trying to establish. "No," Clara said, equally direct. "I'm going to help look after the house for a while. That's all." May seemed to be checking this answer for hidden complications. Papa said we'd had 3 women come to help, and they all left. I don't have anywhere to go, Clara said, so I expect I'll stay longer than they did. The girl looked at her for another moment, then looked at the root cellar door, which Clara had left open. Did you go down there? I did. Mama used to keep things down there. Papa doesn't go in. I noticed it needed organizing, Clara said carefully. If you'd like to help me with that at some point, I'd be glad of the company. May looked at her feet. Maybe, she said. Then she went away. Nathan appeared at dinner and was, as Alderman had described him, a boy working very hard to be something larger than he was yet, watchful of Clara in the way of someone waiting for her to do something wrong. He helped himself to the beans and the cornbread she'd made. She'd found some dried peppers and added those, and some of the preserved pork sliced thin, and the result was better than it probably should have been given the ingredients. And he ate without speaking, which was fine. He didn't have to speak. She wasn't here to be liked. Gideon ate with the same distance. He thanked her for the food, which was more than she'd expected, and then excused himself to go check on something in the barn, which she understood was partially about an actual thing in the barn and partially about needing somewhere to put the strangeness of a woman who wasn't his wife sitting at his table. Sam talked enough for the rest of them combined. He told her that he had a dog named Cooper who wasn't allowed in the house because of the time he ate the corner off a quilt, and that Nathan had let him have some of Nathan's old boots, which were too big, but he was growing into them, and that May was sad a lot, but she was better than she used to be. Sam, Nathan said, not sharply, just quietly. Sam looked at his brother and appeared to decide that this one was a real warning rather than a general one. He went back to his beans. Clara cleared the table that night without asking whether she should or shouldn't. She washed the dishes in the basin, dried them, put them away. She went through the kitchen again by lamplight and made a list in her head. Not on paper, because paper cost something, and she was still working out what resources she had access to. Of what needed doing and in what order. The windows needed recaulking against the cold that was still a month away, but wouldn't stay that way. The lard tin was low. There were mice getting into the flour. She could see the evidence, and that needed addressing before the whole stock was compromised. She went to her room and took off her boots and sat on the edge of the bed. Her feet hurt. They had hurt for years, from the millwork, and they would probably always hurt. She rubbed them mechanically for a few minutes, then lay back and looked at the ceiling. She had been engaged briefly to a man named Edmund Coles in Pittsburgh about 4 years before. That had also not worked out, for reasons that bore enough resemblance to today's reasons that she didn't spend much time thinking about them. She was not, she had decided somewhere around the age of 23, particularly unlucky in love. She was simply built in a way that a certain kind of man looked at, and saw limitations rather than qualities, and those were not men she was likely to be happy with anyway, so perhaps it was a kind of efficiency. She thought about the kitchen, and the root cellar, and the way May had stood in the doorway with her careful, measuring eyes. She thought about the land she had seen on the way here, the enormous flatness of it, the way it made everything feel both more exposed and more possible at the same time. Then she stopped thinking and went to sleep, because she had work in the morning, and she needed to be ready for it. The first week was about learning the shape of things. She woke before anyone else and had the fire going and water heated before Gideon came in from the early chores. She didn't try to impress anyone with the cooking. She made food that was solid and filling and didn't waste anything, and she made enough so that there were no arguments about portions. She watched how Nathan moved through the day and noticed he took on responsibilities his age didn't require. She watched how May dealt with the household objects that had belonged to her mother, careful and deliberate with each one. She watched Sam, who processed grief by ignoring it entirely and throwing himself headlong at every waking moment. She fixed the flour bin first because the mice were a practical crisis. She found the gaps in the floorboard they were using and stuffed them with rags soaked in something from the cellar that smelled unpleasant enough to discourage the interest. She reorganized the dry goods into a system that made sense, things used most often within easiest reach, things needed for preservation separate from things needed for daily cooking. On the 4th day, she found a section of fence near the kitchen garden that had rotted through. She didn't wait to ask Gideon about it. She found what she needed in the outbuilding and replaced the section herself, working slowly and without any particular grace, because fencing was not something she had done much of, but she got it done. The kitchen garden was too far gone to save much of this season, but there were a few things worth pulling, late greens, some scraggly but edible carrots, and she pulled them, and that night there was something in the soup that hadn't come from a jar. Nathan watched her fix the fence from a distance. He didn't say anything that day. On the 5th day, he came and stood near her while she was working on something else, and after a while he said, in a tone of aggressive casualness, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Clara asked, not stopping what she was doing. He didn't answer right away. Then, "The other women who came, one of them cried a lot. One of them tried to reorganize all the furniture and Papa hated it. One of them—" He stopped. "You don't have to tell me about them," Clara said. "I know." He was quiet. "You fixed the fence wrong, by the way. The post needs to be seated deeper or it'll heave out in the frost." She stopped what she was doing and looked at him. "Will you show me the right way?" That surprised him. He'd been expecting an argument or dismissal or an explanation. She could see him recalibrate. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "All right." They fixed the fence post together, Nathan showing her the correct depth and why it mattered, Clara asking questions and doing what he said, and by the end of it something between them had shifted slightly. Not trust. Trust was going to take longer than a fence post, but something that was the beginning of the possibility of trust. Gideon watched them from the barn doorway. He didn't say anything either. The second week, she started going further afield. 1 meal a day was what she'd agreed to, and she kept to it, but she was not willing to spend those meals on anything the children could use. So she supplemented. She knew plants the way she knew most things, practically from need, and the land around the ranch had more to offer than it was currently being asked for. Wild onions near the creek. A stand of late-season berries, small and tart, that were going to go to waste if no one gathered them. She found a colony of rose hips that had gone almost unmolested, and she spent a morning collecting them, which she knew was a peculiar sight if anyone had been watching. This thin, pale woman, from wherever she'd come from, crouched in a field collecting rose hips like she knew what she was doing. She knew what she was doing. She brought everything back and processed it quietly. The rose hips dried and set aside, the berries preserved in a small crock with some of the remaining sugar, the wild onions braided and hung in the kitchen. May came in while she was doing the braiding and stood watching for a while. "I don't know what those are," May said. "Wild onions. They grow down near the creek. Have you been down to the creek?" "Not since—" May stopped. "Not much." Clara nodded and didn't push it. "They taste stronger than the ones we'd buy in town. Good in soups, mostly." May came a little closer and looked at the braided onions. "Mama had dried herbs hanging in the kitchen. They're gone now. I don't know what happened to them." "I can hang more," Clara said. "If you want to help me find them, we could probably get a few more things before the real cold comes." There was a pause. Then May said, "I know where she kept some seeds." It was such a small thing. Clara understood it was not a small thing. "Next spring," she said carefully, "those would be useful." May looked at her for a moment. "All right," she said, and went to find them. It was Gideon who caught her in the evenings. Not purposefully. She was careful not to be caught in anything that could be read as deliberate. But the kitchen was the warmest room in the house, and he had a habit of sitting at the table in the evenings with whatever accounts or correspondence needed doing, and she was usually in the kitchen in the evenings, and so they were in the same room with some regularity. He didn't talk much those first 2 weeks. Neither did she. She worked on mending. She'd found a basket of it that had apparently been accumulating since Ruth got sick, shirts with split seams and socks with holes the size of a child's fist. And he worked on his papers, and the fire burned and the house settled, and sometimes one of the children would come through and sometimes they wouldn't. On a Tuesday evening in the second week, she was working on a tear in Nathan's coat. A bad one, along the shoulder seam, that was going to require something approaching surgery, when Gideon put down his pen and said, out of no particular context, "She used to sit there." Clara looked up. He was looking at the mending basket, not at her. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not I'm sorry I'm sitting here. Just the simple acknowledgement." He picked up his pen again. "It's all right." It wasn't exactly. But that was what men like Gideon Hale said when they meant something more complicated than they had words for right now. She understood that. She went back to the coat. Outside, the first real bite of autumn moved in off the open land and rattled the kitchen window in its frame. The night sounds changed, something in them that wasn't there a week ago, a particular quality to the wind that knew what was coming. Clara knew what was coming too. She had been watching the sky and the land, and she had been thinking ever since she arrived about what needed doing before the cold locked everything down. She pushed the thought aside for tonight. Tonight there was a coat that needed fixing, and a family that needed to find its way to something that felt less like drowning and more like steadying. She worked until the lamp guttered low, then said goodnight to Gideon, who said goodnight back without looking up, and went to her small room off the kitchen and took off her boots and sat on the edge of the bed. She was tired in a way that went through to the bone. She had eaten one small bowl of beans at midday and nothing else, and her stomach registered this as a fact without much complaint because it was used to worse. Her hands ached from the mending, her feet ached from everything. She lay back on the mattress and looked at the ceiling. Outside, the wind moved across the open land with nothing to slow it down. She thought about the berries she'd preserved, and the dried rose hips, and the wild onions hanging in the kitchen. She thought about the root cellar and what it would need to hold this family through to spring. She thought about the seeds May had mentioned, the ones Ruth had saved. She thought about what it would take to get this family through to spring. Then she closed her eyes, and the wind kept moving outside, and she slept. She had been at the ranch 3 weeks before anyone said anything directly unkind to her face. It came from a woman named Bertha Colson, who arrived one morning with her husband on some errand related to a shared fence line between the Hale property and the Colson place to the north. Bertha was the kind of woman who filled a room not by doing anything in particular, but simply by being large in spirit and opinion. And she stood in the kitchen doorway while her husband went out to the barn with Gideon, looking at Clara with the frank appraisal of someone who had heard a version of the story and was now comparing it to the original. "You're the one Frank Alderman brought out," she said. It wasn't a question. "That's right," Clara said. She was rendering lard at the stove, a job that required attention and produced a smell that not everyone enjoyed, and she didn't stop doing it. "Thomas Greer's girl." "I was never Thomas Greer's girl," Clara said. "We exchanged letters. That's different." Bertha seemed to find this distinction either interesting or irritating. Clara couldn't quite tell which. She came further into the kitchen and looked around at the hanging onions, the reorganized shelves, the mending basket that was now notably less full than it had been. "How long have you been here?" 3 weeks. Bertha picked up one of the dried rose hips from the jar on the counter, looked at it, set it back down. "You look like you've been ill." "I've never been ill," Clara said, which was almost true. "I'm naturally slight. You look like a strong wind would take you sideways." Clara moved the pan off the direct heat and turned to look at Bertha Colson for the first time since the woman had walked in. She held her gaze for a moment without any particular expression. The fence post by the east kitchen garden has been reset at the correct depth. The dry goods are organized and mouse-proofed. There's enough preserved food in this kitchen right now to stretch through 2 weeks of bad weather without anyone going into the main cellar stores, and I've been adding to the cellar stores as well. She paused. "What would you like for coffee?" Bertha stared at her. Then something happened in the woman's face that might have been the beginning of respect, though it was too early to say. "Black," she said. "Thank you." They sat at the kitchen table while the husbands talked in the barn, and Bertha asked questions the way some women did, steadily, without apology. And Clara answered them or didn't, depending on what they were. She didn't explain herself. She didn't make her case. She had learned a long time ago that explaining yourself to people who had already made up their mind about you was a particular kind of exhaustion that didn't pay. When the Colsons left, Bertha paused in the yard and turned back to say something to Clara that came out with the deliberateness of a woman revising a judgment. "The Hale children have had a hard year," she said. "I know," Clara said. "Ruth was well liked." "I understand." Bertha looked at her for another moment. "You're not what I expected either," she said, and got in the wagon. Clara watched the wagon go and then went back inside to finish the lard. It was Nathan who first noticed what she was doing in the evenings. She had started small, because small was the only way to start when you were working with almost nothing. Every time she cooked, she calculated, not on paper, in her head, which was faster and left no evidence of anything for anyone to question. She knew how much the household was consuming per week. She knew what the cellar held. She knew, with the particular precision of someone who had spent years doing arithmetic against scarcity, roughly what the gap was between what they had and what they would need when January came and the roads became unreliable and the ground froze hard enough that nothing came out of it. She had been filling that gap quietly, one handful at a time. The dried greens she'd collected from the creek bottom. The berries, which were now a full crock rather than a partial one, because she'd found a second stand of them closer to the eastern fence. More rose hips, fat rendered from every scrap of meat that came through the kitchen. Nothing wasted, everything processed. Dried fruit from the apple tree at the back of the property that Gideon had apparently forgotten existed. Bread that she made in larger quantities than needed for a given day, and then cut the excess into croutons and dried them slowly at the edge of the stove heat until they were rock hard and would keep for months. She stored it all in the back section of the root cellar, behind the main stores, where it was easy to miss if you weren't looking. She wasn't hiding it exactly. She just wasn't announcing it because she was still building it, and because she had learned that announcing a plan while it was still forming gave other people the opportunity to question it before it was strong enough to defend. Nathan found her there on a Tuesday evening in the 4th week, when she'd gone down with a lamp to do the weekly accounting. He had come looking for a jar of something or other and had followed the light. He stood at the bottom of the cellar stairs and looked at what she'd organized along the back wall. He had his father's quality of stillness when something surprised him. He went quiet rather than loud. "What is all this?" he said. "Reserves," she said, "in case we need them." He came closer and looked at the careful rows, the dried greens bundled and tied, the breadcrumbs in their sealed jar, the rendered fat in its crock, the dried fruit laid out on a cloth. In case of what? Winter. She held up the lamp so he could see better. "We've had a dry fall. That usually means a hard winter, and this cellar has enough to get through a normal winter fine. But if the roads close for more than 3 weeks, or we get a freeze that goes deep and long..." She stopped, because she wasn't trying to frighten him. "I just like to have more than I need." Nathan was looking at the breadcrumbs. "Those are from the extra loaves." "Yes. I thought you were just making too much." "I was making exactly as much as I intended to," she said. "I just wasn't explaining it." He was quiet for a moment. He was 12, but he had the kind of mind that moved through things methodically. She'd noticed that about him. He didn't jump to conclusions. He worked through them. "How long have you been doing this?" "Since the 1st week." He looked at her. In the lamplight, with his face doing that careful, deliberate work of processing something unexpected, he looked less like he was trying to be older than he was, and more simply like himself. "You thought there was going to be a problem before any of us did." "I thought there might be," she said. "I could be wrong." "But you prepared anyway." "I always prepare anyway," she said. "It costs more not to." He was quiet again. Then he reached past her and straightened one of the dried bundle of greens that had shifted slightly. It was a small gesture, almost unconscious, the kind you made when something was yours to take care of. She noticed it and didn't say anything about it. They went back upstairs together, and neither of them mentioned it at dinner. What she gave the children, she gave slowly and without ceremony, because anything that looked like a gift made children suspicious, and anything that looked like a lesson made them resistant. So she didn't do either. She just did things alongside them, or showed them things when they were nearby, or asked for help with something she could easily have done herself. With Sam, it was the simplest. He didn't need much except for someone to be genuinely interested in what he was doing, and she was, because he was genuinely interesting. He had a way of narrating his own life as he lived it, a constant commentary on whatever he was doing and why, and she had learned to listen to it with real attention rather than the half attention that most adults gave small children, and he felt the difference. He would follow her around the kitchen explaining at length why Cooper the dog was fundamentally misunderstood and why the specific way he had rearranged the rocks near the well was an improvement on the previous arrangement, and she would ask questions that showed she had been listening, and he was happy. With May, it was more delicate. Ruth had been the kind of mother who taught her daughter things by making them matter, and May had learned accordingly. She knew how to make 3 different kinds of preserves. She knew which of the ranch cats would let you pick them up and which would not. She knew the names of the mountains visible on clear days to the west. All of this knowledge had the quality of something precious and somewhat painful, because every piece of it had come from her mother, and her mother was gone. Clara didn't try to add to it. She tried to use it. "Which jar did she use for the plum preserves?" she asked May one afternoon when she was organizing the pantry. May pointed to the correct jar without hesitation. "And these ones?" Clara pointed to a row of sealed jars that were unlabeled. "Do you know what's in them?" May came closer and looked. She picked up each jar in turn with a careful deliberateness that Clara recognized. "Apple butter. This one's apple butter, too. This is the green tomato relish. She made that in September. It's good with pork." She paused at one jar that was a darker color. "I don't know this one." "Looks like chokecherry, maybe," Clara said. "We could open it and see." They opened it, and it was chokecherry, and May seemed to know the taste the moment it hit her tongue, because her expression did something complicated in private. Clara didn't comment on it. She put the label on the jar, chokecherry jam, September, and moved to the next one. "She always labeled everything," May said after a moment. "Good practice," Clara said. "Otherwise you forget." "I helped her sometimes. She let me write the labels when I was little." "Would you want to do that now? I've got some paper I've been saving." May looked at the jar in her hand. "The handwriting won't look the same." "No," Clara agreed. "It'll look like yours." May was quiet for a long time. Then she set the jar down and said, "All right, where's the paper?" Gideon noticed all of it. She knew he did, the way she knew most things about the household, not because anyone told her, but because she paid attention. He was not an unobservant man. He watched his children the way parents watch children when they'd recently been frightened, with the particular vigilance of someone who had discovered that things they relied on could be taken suddenly. He noticed when Nathan was steadier. He noticed when May had a better day. He noticed when Sam ate his dinner without having to be asked twice. He was just not entirely sure what to do with what he noticed. He came in one evening at the end of the 4th week when the wind had shifted and the air had a particular quality that Clara had been watching for. He came in with the look of a man who had been calculating something outdoors that he didn't like the results of, and he sat at the kitchen table and accepted the coffee she put in front of him without speaking for a few minutes. Then he said, "Sky looks wrong." "Yes, she sees sauce," she said, "early for that. It's been a strange fall." She sat down across from him, which she'd started doing in the evening sometimes, not as a social claim, but simply because standing when you didn't need to was tiring and the kitchen chair was close. "How much of the supply run to town have you been able to do?" He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Got most of it done in October. There's still the flour order and some salt I need to pick up." He looked at the window. "May not be as much time as I thought." "I can give you a list of what we have," she said, "so you know what actually needs picking up versus what we can manage without." He looked at her. "You have a list?" "In my head, but I can write it out." He was quiet for a moment. "How bad do you think it'll be?" She considered whether to be straight with him or careful, and decided, as she usually did, on straight. "I don't know. It might be nothing. One hard week, and then it opens up again. Or it might not." She looked at the window. "I've been putting some things by in the cellar, just in case." "What kind of things?" She told him. He listened the way he listened to everything, without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Since the 1st week," he said. Not quite a question. "Yes." He rubbed his jaw with one hand. He had a habit of doing this when he was working something out. "I should have been doing that." "You've been keeping the operation running," she said. "That's not nothing. It's not enough if we can't eat." "No," she said, "but that's why I'm here." He looked at her across the kitchen table. The lamp was between them, and the light made everything look more serious than it maybe was, or maybe exactly as serious as it was. She couldn't always tell with Gideon Hale. He had a face that kept its own counsel. "You eat almost nothing," he said. "I eat enough." "I've watched. You take less than the children." "The children are growing," she said. "I'm not." "That's not—" He stopped. He picked up his coffee cup and set it back down without drinking from it. "You can eat more than you're eating. I want you to." It was not gracefully said. He was not a graceful man, she had gathered, not in the sense of knowing how to smooth things over with words, but it was said with genuine intent, and she understood the difference between something meant and something polished. "All right," she said. He nodded and picked up his pen, returning to his papers. She returned to the mending. The wind moved against the north side of the house, and the lamp flame went slight and came back. The first real cold came on a Thursday. She woke before dawn to a different sound than usual. Not the ordinary creak of the house in wind, but something more settled and heavy, a silence of a particular quality that she recognized from winters in Pittsburgh when the snow had come down hard overnight. She got up and opened the window a crack, and the air that came in had temperature and weight in it that confirmed what she'd thought. She dressed in the dark and went to the kitchen and got the fire going and started the porridge before anyone else was awake. When Gideon came in from the early chores, stamping snow off his boots in the doorway, she had coffee ready. "How much?" she asked. 6 inches on the ground. More coming." He came to the stove and wrapped his hands around the mug. His face was red from the cold and his breath was still visible indoors for a moment. "Wind's out of the north." Nathan appeared a few minutes later, then Sam at a dead run who had to be firmly turned around and put back into warmer clothes before he was allowed in the kitchen. May came last, quiet as usual, and stood looking out the window at the changed yard. "Is it going to be bad?" Nathan asked his father. Gideon looked at Clara. It was an odd thing, that look. The reflexive checking of someone who had begun, without quite deciding to count a person's opinion as relevant. "Don't know yet," he said. "Could blow through." "Could stay," Clara said. She was spooning porridge into bowls. "Either way, we're all right." Nathan looked at her. He knew what she meant. The cellar, the reserves, the things she'd been quietly building since October. He looked back at his bowl and started eating. It stayed. Not dramatically, not in the way of stories about blizzards that killed livestock and left families frozen in their houses. It stayed in the practical, grinding way of hard winters, which was its own kind of difficult. 3 days of snow, a brief clearing, 4 more days of snow, temperatures that kept the ground locked, and the road to town a question mark. The cattle needed more attention in the cold, which meant Gideon and Nathan were outside longer and came in colder and harder every evening. May took on more of the kitchen work without being asked, which Clara noticed and appreciated and didn't make a fuss about, because May didn't want a fuss. Sam's primary contribution was maintaining a detailed running commentary on the snow's various dimensions and properties, and the activities of Cooper the dog, who had been given a special dispensation to live in the barn for the duration. On the 6th day, Gideon came in at midday looking like the morning had argued with him, and won. He sat at the table without taking his coat off. "Lost one of the heifers," he said. "Found her at the north fence. Couldn't get to her in time." The table was quiet. "I'm sorry," Clara said. She put coffee in front of him. "It happens." He said it the way people said things that were true but didn't help. "How are we on supplies?" "Fine," she said. "We're fine." He looked up. "I have enough in the cellar to go another 3 weeks without touching the main stores," she said. 2 weeks easily. More if we're careful, and we're being careful. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was more complicated than that. Something closer to the relief of a man who had been holding his breath for a while and was trying to decide if it was safe to exhale. "Show me," he said. So she took him down to the cellar and showed him the back section. The careful rows, the sealed crocks, the bundled greens, the breadcrumbs. He moved the lamp slowly along the shelves without saying anything for a long time. She stood back and let him look. "You did all this," he said finally. Not a question. "Nathan helped toward the end," she said. "May helped me process the apple butter." He looked at the jars. She had written labels in her careful handwriting, dates and contents, and it occurred to her now that May's handwriting was on the chokecherry jam. He would know that. He looked at the chokecherry jam for a moment and then looked away. "I thought you were making extra bread for the children," he said. "I was making extra bread for all of us," she said, just not in a way that was obvious. He set the lamp on a shelf and turned to look at her. He had snow still in his hair from the morning, and his face was tired, and she thought he was probably going to say something about gratitude or managing or some version of thank you that would cost him something to say. Instead, he said, "What made you start in the first week? You didn't know any of us." She thought about this. "I look at things," she said. "The land, the cellar, the sky. I could see what kind of fall it was going to be, and I knew what that usually means for winter. It didn't have anything to do with knowing you. You could have just done your job, he said, what I hired you to do. This is my job, she said simply. Looking after the household is what I'm here to do. All of it, not just the part that's visible. He looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up the lamp and went back up the stairs, and she followed him, and nothing else was said about it that day. But at dinner that night, Gideon gave her the largest portion without comment, and when she started to redirect it towards Sam, he said, quietly, but with enough finality that she understood it wasn't negotiable, "Eat it." She ate it. Sam told Cooper through the kitchen window in the direction of the barn that the snow had now achieved a depth of approximately up to his knee if he stood in the deep part, which was a record in his personal experience. Nobody pointed out that he'd only been alive for 5 winters, and most of them were hazy. It was May who said it out loud, which surprised Clara somewhat because May rarely said things out loud when she could keep them internal. They were in the kitchen together on the 8th day of the cold stretch, May stirring something on the stove while Clara worked on a split in the shoulder seam of Gideon's heaviest coat, the one he'd been wearing in weather that required it. It needed proper attention, and she'd been putting it off until she had the right thread, which she'd finally found in the bottom of Ruth's sewing basket. May said, without looking up from the stove, "Are you eating enough?" Clara paused. "I'm eating more than I was." "That's not the same as enough." She looked at the girl. May was still stirring, not looking at her, with the deliberateness of someone who had decided to say a thing and was going to say it but preferred to do so sideways. "Your father said something similar," Clara said. "I know, I heard him." Now May did look up, briefly, with her careful level eyes. "You always put yourself last." "I've been watching." "I'm fine, May." "You're tired," said with the directness of a child who had not yet learned to soften observations. "Your hands shake sometimes in the morning when you're cold." Clara looked at her hands, which were not shaking at the moment. "Everyone's hands shake in the cold." "Not like that." May put down the spoon and turned to face her. "After Mama got sick, she kept saying she was fine. She said it right up until she wasn't. She stopped. She swallowed once, the way people did when they were keeping something from spilling over. I'm not saying you're sick. I'm just saying that people who say they're fine aren't always fine." Clara set down the coat she was mending. She considered May, the serious, watchful face, the set of her shoulders that was so like her father's when he was working through something. This girl had lost her mother 8 months ago and had been paying attention with both eyes open ever since, filing things away, looking for patterns, trying to predict the next loss before it found her. "All right," Claire said, "I'll eat the full portions." "Starting today?" "Starting today." May picked up her spoon again. "Okay." "May." The girl looked up. "You're very observant." "Mama said that too," May said. She went back to stirring, and there was something in her face that was private and not for sharing, and Clara left it alone. But at dinner that evening, she ate the full portion without redirecting anything, and when Gideon glanced at her plate, she looked back at him with an expression that communicated, clearly enough, that some things had been settled. He looked at May. May was eating with great focus and attention, performing innocence badly. He looked back at his food without saying anything. Nathan, who had been watching all of this, said nothing either, but he refilled Clara's coffee cup without being asked. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. Some things got said in other ways. On the 12th day, the sky broke open clear and cold and brilliant, the kind of winter day that looks like an apology from the weather. The road to town had been used by enough other travelers during the cold stretch that it was passable, barely, and Gideon rode out in the morning to check on the condition of the herd at the far pasture. Clara went outside for the first time in several days, just to stand in it for a while. The cold was sharp and immediate, and the snow made everything unfamiliar. The yard reduced to its simplest elements, the barn a dark shape against white, the fence lines just visible under their covering. In the distance, the hills to the west were clear against a sky that had no ambiguity in it. Sam came out 30 seconds after her, fully equipped for outdoor operations, and proceeded immediately to fall face first into a snowbank. He came up laughing, which was the best possible outcome for everyone involved. "Cooper's going to love this," he announced, pushing snow off his coat. Cooper is staying in the barn until it warms up, Clara said. Cooper would disagree with that. Cooper doesn't make the decisions. Sam considered this injustice for a moment. What if I'm cold and I want Cooper next to me? Then you should have thought of that before you fell in the snow, Clara said. Sam looked at the snowbank. He looked at Clara. He appeared to be performing a calculation. That's not really fair, he said. It's very fair, she said. Go find your sister. He went, complaining loudly at no one in particular, and Clara stood in the cold yard and looked out at the white hills and breathed the air that had nothing compromised in it. Her lungs handled it better than she expected, better than they used to. She had been here 6 weeks. The household was not the same one she had walked into. She was not the same person who had walked into it, either, though she couldn't have said precisely how. What she knew was that the reserves in the cellar were holding. The children were steadier than they had been. The house ran the way a house was supposed to run. Not smoothly, because nothing ran smoothly when there were real people in it, but with enough structure that the difficult days were survivable and the good days felt like they might be earned. It wasn't enough. It wasn't finished. There was still the rest of winter to get through, and the thaw, and whatever came after that. But this morning, with the snow on the hills and Sam's voice carrying across the yard in high complaint, and the smell of the porridge she'd left simmering on the back of the stove, drifting out through the door she'd left open, this morning felt like something. She wasn't sure what to call it. Not happiness exactly, or not only that. Something more like, I am in the right place, doing a thing that matters. She went back inside before the cold got into her properly, and she checked the porridge, and she listened to Sam's voice outside and May's quieter response, and the ordinary morning sounds of the ranch, and she thought about what the cellar still needed and what she could do about it once the weather held. There was still a lot of work to do. There always was. She pushed her sleeves up and got started. The second cold wave came without the courtesy of a warning. The first freeze had been survivable. Hard, yes, and longer than anyone had hoped, but survivable in the way that tested a household and found it mostly sound. What came in the third week of January was different in kind. Clara felt it before she could see it, the way the air in the early morning had a particular density to it that was not just cold but waiting, the kind of atmospheric pressure that meant the weather was about to stop being a temporary condition and become a permanent fact of life for a while. She went out at first light and stood in the yard and looked at the sky to the north. It had a color she didn't like, not dramatic, nothing that would make you think of storm illustrations in a newspaper. Just a flat, colorless quality, like the sky had finished with its usual business and decided to do something else entirely. She went back inside and started making a list. On paper this time, because what she needed to calculate was too large for her head alone. When Gideon came in from the early chores, she put the list in front of him without preamble. He looked at it, then looked at her, then looked at it again. You think it's going to be that bad? He said. I think it might be, she said. And I'd rather have this conversation now than in 3 days when we can't. He sat down and read through it carefully. She had itemized everything. What the main cellar held, what her reserves held, what the livestock would need, what the household would need, the rough arithmetic of days against supplies in 3 different scenarios depending on how long the freeze lasted. She had done the numbers twice, from different directions, to make sure they agreed. The potatoes, he said, pointing to a line on the list. They're fine for now, but if the temperature in the root cellar drops below a certain point, they'll freeze and we'll lose them. She had been thinking about this since the previous evening. We should bring some upstairs. The kitchen stays warm enough. He nodded slowly. What else? The water barrel by the barn is going to freeze solid. Nathan and I can pack it with straw to slow it down, but we should also get extra water into the house now while we can. And the cattle... She stopped, because the cattle were his domain, and she didn't want to overstep into something she knew less about. What do you need from me to help with the cattle? He looked at her. It was the same look he'd given her in the cellar during the first freeze, that expression of a man recalibrating something he thought he'd already measured. I need to get them closer in, he said. The north pasture ones. It'll take most of the morning. I'll have food ready when you come back. She paused. Take Nathan. He's 12. He's capable, she said, and he knows it, and you don't tell him often enough. Gideon opened his mouth and then closed it again. He folded the list and put it in his shirt pocket. I'll take Nathan, he said. They worked through that morning in parallel. Gideon and Nathan on horseback moving the cattle in from the exposed north pasture, Clara and May in the house and yard doing what could be done before the cold locked down. The potatoes came upstairs in 2 loads, a heavy crate that Clara carried by sheer stubbornness while May managed the root cellar door. The water barrel project involved straw and rope, and Sam, who was genuinely useful at threading rope through tight spaces and genuinely hindrance at almost everything else, but who made up for it by keeping up a constant narration of events that somehow made the work feel less grim. "The straw is going in good," Sam reported, crouched beside the barrel with his small hands pushing material into the gaps. "I think this is the best straw job I've ever seen." "You've never done a straw job before," May said. "That's why it's the best one I've ever seen." He looked up at Clara. "Is it going to be really bad?" She was tying off the rope, and she didn't look up immediately. She had a policy about lying to children, which was that she didn't, but she also had a policy about the difference between telling the truth and frightening people unnecessarily. "It might be cold for a while," she said, "but we've got good supplies and we've got the house, and we know what we're doing." Sam considered this. Cooper should come inside. Cooper has the barn. But what if he's scared? Dogs don't get scared of weather. They get cold. She looked at him now. He has the barn. He has straw. He has the body heat from the other animals. He's better off there than in the house. She paused. "If it gets very bad, I'll ask your father." Sam seemed to find this satisfactory. He went back to his straw. May had been quiet through all of it, working steadily and without complaint, which was her way. But when they were bringing the last of the water containers inside, she stopped in the doorway and said, "How long did you know? Before today, I mean." "I've been watching the weather pattern for about a week," Clara said honestly. "I wasn't certain. I'm still not certain, but I thought it was better to be ready." "The reserves you put in the cellar," May said. "Were those for this?" "For something like this," Clara said. "I didn't know what shape it would take." May looked out at the yard, which had gone gray and still in a way that was different from the ordinary gray of a winter morning. "Mama used to watch the sky," she said. "She'd stand at that window." She nodded toward the kitchen window, and she'd look north and she'd say, "Well, it's going to be something." She always knew. Clara didn't say anything to that. She let it sit. After a moment, May picked up her end of the water container, and they carried it inside together. Gideon and Nathan came back at noon with cold in their faces and the particular controlled blankness of men who had been outside in weather that didn't want them there. Nathan was quieter than usual, which Clara read as a sign that things had been harder than expected rather than easier. She put food in front of both of them without asking questions, and when Gideon had eaten half his bowl, he said, "2 of the heifers. They wouldn't move." "Where are they now?" "Still north. I couldn't get them without risking the others." He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "If this is as bad as it looks, I'm going to lose them." Nathan stared at his food. "We got most of them in," Clara said. "Most isn't all," Gideon said. It wasn't directed at her. He was talking to himself the way people did when they were accounting for losses they hadn't finished absorbing. "I should have moved them last week." "You didn't know last week." "You suspected last week." "I suspected," she said. "I wasn't sure. There's a difference, and you had other things to manage." She looked at Nathan, who was still staring at his bowl. "Nathan, you did good work this morning." The boy looked up. His father looked at him too, and then at Clara, and something crossed his face that was complicated. A man recognizing that he had just been reminded of something he should have said first. "She's right," Gideon said. "You did." Nathan looked between the 2 of them like he was trying to figure out what was happening. Then he went back to his food. But something in his shoulders had changed. Tut. The freeze came down that afternoon like a door closing. The temperature dropped faster than Clara had seen in a long time. Not gradually, the way cold usually moved in, but in a way that felt purposeful. By mid-afternoon, the water she'd left in the bucket near the back door had a skim of ice on it. By late afternoon, the window glass had taken on the particular opacity of serious cold, a faint fog at the edges that no amount of wiping could clear because it wasn't condensation from inside. It was the outside pressing in. Gideon made 3 more trips to the barn to check the livestock and came back each time looking grimmer. On the third trip, Nathan went with him and came back looking the same. Clara had dinner ready when they returned the last time. Not just the soup she'd had simmering, but bread she'd baked during the afternoon, and some of the preserved apple butter May had helped label back in the fall, because she thought this was an evening that needed something that felt like more than survival. They sat at the table and ate, and the wind came up outside and the house made its settling sounds, the familiar complaints of wood and cold, and for a while nobody said much. Then Sam looked up from his plate and said, "Are we going to be okay?" He asked it the way 5-year-olds ask things, directly, with no softening, because they hadn't yet learned to protect themselves from the possibility that the answer might be no. Clara looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at Sam. "Yeah," Gideon said. "We're going to be okay." "How do you know?" "Because we've got enough." He glanced at Clara. "More than enough." Sam looked at Clara too. "Is that because of the cellar stuff?" "Partly," Clara said. "I helped with that," Sam said with satisfaction. "I carried things." "You carried one jar," May said. "A heavy jar. It had breadcrumbs in it." This was apparently a matter of some importance to Sam's account of his contribution to household survival, and he argued it with energy until Nathan told him to eat his dinner in a tone that was unmistakably his father's, which had the intended effect. Clara caught Gideon's eye across the table. He looked away first, but not quickly. It was the look of a man who was noticing something he wasn't quite ready to examine. The freeze lasted 11 days. Not all of them were equally bad. The first 4 were the worst, temperatures that made going outside a serious decision, requiring preparation and a clear reason. The barn checks happened twice a day, no more, because every extra trip burned body heat the household couldn't afford to waste. Clara managed the indoor supplies with the precision of someone who had been rehearsing for this, not because she had known this exact emergency was coming, but because she had spent her whole life inside situations that required stretching limited resources as far as they would go. She had been doing that arithmetic since she was a child, since the mill, since the boarding house, since every situation she'd been in where the margin between enough and not enough was narrower than anyone who'd never lived there could understand. The reserves held. Not easily, but there were 3 days when she was doing serious mathematics in her head about what they could use and what they needed to save, recalculating every time something changed. When the main cellar temperature dropped low enough to threaten the remaining potatoes, she brought the rest upstairs and rearranged the kitchen to accommodate them, and didn't say anything to Gideon about it because there was nothing useful he could do about it, and he had enough to worry about. When the flour supply started to run lower than she'd projected, Sam had a hungry week, as growing children did, unpredictably. She adjusted the bread recipe to stretch the flour further with some of the dried cornmeal, and the result was edible, if not what anyone would have chosen under other circumstances. On the 6th day, when Gideon came in from the barn with the news she had been waiting to not hear, the 2 heifers he'd left in the north pasture were gone, frozen where they stood. Clara made coffee and put it in front of him and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say about a loss that was real and final and nobody's particular fault. He sat at the table for a long time. She worked quietly at the stove. After a while, he said, "That's $200, roughly, maybe more." "I know." "We were going to use that toward the spring fence repair." "I know." "The fence repair needs to happen. The north section has been—" He stopped. He put his hands flat on the table. "I'm just telling you, so I'm saying it to someone." "I understand," she said. "Say it." He looked at her. "This is a hard year," he said. "This is a very hard year, and I am trying to keep it together, and some days I don't know if I'm managing." "You're managing," she said. She turned from the stove and looked at him directly, the way she'd learned to look at things, without flinching away, without prettying it up. "You kept the operation running through a bad fall, and you've kept it running through this. The cattle that matter are safe. The children are fine. The house is warm and there's food on the table." She paused. "It's a hard year, that's true. But you're still standing in it." He looked at her for a moment. The expression on his face was one she hadn't seen from him before. Something more unguarded than his usual. The look of a man who was tired enough that his careful management of his own face had slipped slightly. "You're too thin," he said. It came out sideways, unconnected to anything, the way things came out when people were saying something else and couldn't find the direct route. I watch you at meals. You still take less than you should. I eat what I need. I don't think that's true. He looked at the table. Ruth used to do that. Put herself last. She always said she wasn't hungry. He stopped. I should have paid more attention then. The kitchen was quiet except for the wind outside and the fire. I'm not Ruth, Clara said carefully. I know that. He said it quickly, without looking up. I know you're not. She turned back to the stove. She didn't push it further because there were things that needed to find their own pace, and this was one of them. Tomorrow I'm going to make enough bread for the week, she said, practical again, on purpose. And I found the last of the dried apple in the cellar. I'll put it in, for the children. For everyone, he said. For everyone, she agreed. Okay. It was on the 8th day of the freeze that May found her. Clara had gotten up before dawn, which was her habit, but she'd woken with a headache that came from somewhere behind her eyes and had the particular quality of sustained cold and insufficient rest. She was sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, not doing anything, which was rare enough for her that it would have surprised anyone who saw it. May came in quietly, the way May did everything. She stood in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown with her feet in her mother's old wool slippers that were 3 sizes too large and looked at Clara. You're up early, she said. Couldn't sleep, Clara said. Go back to bed. It's cold. May came and sat across from her instead. She pulled her nightgown over her knees and tucked her feet up on the chair and looked at Clara with that steady, assessing gaze that Clara had come to recognize as just the way May saw the world. Your head hurts, May said. Not a question. A little. May got up without saying anything and went to the cabinet that Clara had reorganized in the first week. She reached to the back, behind the dry goods, and found a small cloth packet that Clara had not put there. She came back and set it on the table. Mama kept this. Dried willow bark. She said it helped when her head hurt. Clara looked at the small packet. She picked it up carefully. When did you find this? I've always known it was there, May said. She sat back down and tucked her feet up again. I didn't know if it was still good. Clara opened the packet and smelled it. Old, but still present. She got up and added some to her tea, slowly, the way you did with things that needed time to work. Thank you, she said. May shrugged, which was teenage in spirit, if not yet in fact. Mama said you should take care of the people who take care of you. She looked at the window, where the darkness outside had the particular quality of a deep cold night that had no interest in becoming morning. She was good at that. She sounds like she was, Clara said. She wasn't perfect, said quickly, almost offensively, as if anticipating a kind of sentimentality she wanted to head off. She lost her temper sometimes. She and Papa used to argue about the accounts. She thought he was too generous with credit, and he thought she was too tight with it. She burned the bread twice in my whole life, and she talked about it for weeks. A small pause. But she paid attention to people. She noticed when something was wrong before they said anything. Clara looked at her. Like you do. May looked down at her hands. She used to say I got that from her. She was right. The silence that followed was the kind that didn't need filling. Clara drank her tea, which was beginning to work in the way of things that needed time. May sat with her feet tucked up and looked at the stove, which was warming the kitchen back to something manageable, and outside the wind moved across the frozen land and the house held against it. After a while, May said, I'm glad you stayed. Clara didn't say anything immediately. She looked at the girl across the table, the serious face, the 2 big slippers, the careful way she held things that mattered. I'm glad too, she said. It was not a complicated thing to say. That was what made it true. On the 11th day, the temperature lifted by degrees, as if the cold were experimenting with the idea of relenting before it committed to anything. By afternoon, Gideon said the road to town might be passable in another 2 days. Nathan said the south-facing slope near the barn had lost some of its snow already. Sam said Cooper had been observed in the barn doorway, looking at the yard with what Sam characterized as definite interest, though May said that was just Cooper being Cooper. Clara took stock of what was left. She did it in the cellar, the same way she always did. Lamp in one hand, mental arithmetic running in the other, checking each item against her internal record of what had been used and when. The main stores were lower than she'd hoped, but not critically. They had done better than her middle scenario and slightly worse than her best case, which was about what you could expect from 11 days of genuine winter. The reserves were almost gone. She stood and looked at the near-empty back section, the swept shelves where the breadcrumbs and dried greens had been, the 2 remaining crocks of rendered fat. It was strange, looking at something she'd built and watching how completely it had been used. She didn't feel regret. She felt something closer to satisfaction, which she was careful about because satisfaction could tip into pride, and pride had a way of making you careless. But she had built this. She had built it quietly, from almost nothing, because she had paid attention to what was coming, and she had trusted her own read on it, even when no one else was looking. And it had held the family through 11 days of real cold without touching the main stores significantly, without anyone going hungry, and this was the thing she hadn't said out loud to anyone, without what could have happened to a household that wasn't prepared. She heard footsteps on the cellar stairs and turned. Gideon came down with a lamp of his own, the way he had during the first freeze, and stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at the back section. He was quiet for a moment. "It's gone," he said. "Almost. The fat crocks are still there." He moved the lamp slowly along the empty shelves, the same way he'd moved it the first time when they were full. "You built all of this for one purpose," he said. "I built it because I thought we might need it." "We needed it." He turned and looked at her. "Clara." Her name, said directly, for one of the only times since she'd arrived. "We would have been in serious trouble without this." "Maybe," she said. "I don't know for certain." "I know for certain," he said. "I did the same arithmetic you did. I've been doing it for 11 days. We would have eaten through the main stores by day 7 and been on short rations after that. In this cold, with the children—" He stopped. He set his lamp on the shelf. "I need you to hear this directly because I don't think I've said it clearly enough." She waited. "What you did matters," he said. "Not just the supplies, all of it, since you got here." He had the manner of a man making himself say something he'd been working up to for a while. Not because it wasn't true, but because saying it required accepting how much it was true. "I didn't know what I was taking on when Alderman brought you out. I thought—" He stopped again. "I thought I was doing you a favor as much as anything. 1 meal a day and a bed, because you didn't have anywhere else to go." "You were," Clara said, "at the time." "No," he shook his head. "I was wrong about what the arrangement was. You knew something I didn't. You've known things I didn't since the first week." He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. "I'm trying to say that I see that. What you've built here. What you've done for the children." A pause. "What you've done for me." The cellar was cold and quiet around them. The lamplight made everything simple, just 2 people in a small space, talking. "You don't have to say all this," Clara said, not defensively, just honestly. "I know I don't have to," he said. "That's why I'm saying it." She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. He had a way of holding eye contact that she'd noticed early on. Not aggressive, not challenging, just present. A man who didn't look away from things. "All right," she said. "I hear you." He picked up his lamp. She picked up hers. They went back up the stairs together and into the kitchen, which was warm and smelled of the beans she'd put on this morning, and Nathan was at the table doing something with a piece of leather harness that needed repair, and Sam was on the floor constructing something out of firewood scraps that he appeared to be calling a fort, and May was at the window looking out at the yard where the snow was going gray-white in the late afternoon light. "Can Cooper come inside now?" Sam asked, not looking up from his fort. Gideon looked at Clara. Clara looked at Gideon. "One night," Gideon said. "He sleeps by the door." Sam made a sound of triumph so complete it startled Nathan, who knocked over the harness, which knocked over part of the fort, and for a few minutes the kitchen was loud in the way of a family that was, for the moment, all right. Clara went to the stove and checked the beans. Outside, the temperature continued to lift by slow degrees, and the road to town became something that would be passable by morning, and somewhere in the north pasture, the last hard evidence of what this winter had cost the ranch lay under 2 feet of snow, a debt that would need accounting for when spring came. But that was for later. Tonight the house was warm, and there was food on the stove, and a dog of questionable reputation was about to be admitted to the premises for one night, with the strong probability that one night would extend considerably beyond its original mandate. Clara knew that too. She kept it to herself. She stirred the beans and listened to the kitchen and let the evening be what it was. Cooper did not sleep by the door. He slept at the foot of Sam's bed, which everyone knew was going to happen and nobody said out loud because some things were better arrived at than announced. By the second morning, he was considered a permanent fixture, and by the end of the week, the question of Cooper's sleeping arrangements had been renegotiated entirely through the silent democratic process of a household that had stopped paying attention to the original rule. Spring came to the Hale Ranch the way it always came to that part of the country, not as an arrival, but as a slow, argumentative negotiation between winter and everything else. February still had hard days in it, mornings where the ground was iron and the breath came out in clouds, but they were interspersed now with afternoons that had actual warmth in them, actual light, the kind that made you lift your face without thinking about it. The snow came and went and came again, but with less conviction each time, and the mud that replaced it was the particular mud of thaw, dark and rich smelling, the smell of things beginning again. Clara noticed the change in the household the way she noticed most things, gradually and then all at once. Nathan had started asking her things, not dramatically, not with any announcement that a relationship had shifted, but in the way of a 12-year-old who had decided, without quite saying so, that a person's opinion was worth having. He asked about the fence repair calculations. He asked whether she thought the spring planting should be expanded from last year's plot. And when she said she thought it should and told him why, he argued two of her points and conceded two others, and they arrived at something neither of them had started with, which was how the best conversations worked. May had started smiling more. Not constantly. She was still a serious child and probably always would be. And there were still days when the grief came up behind her eyes and made everything harder. But the intervals between those days were longer than they'd been in the fall. And Sam had taught Cooper to sit, which he announced at dinner one evening with the gravity of someone reporting a significant scientific development, and which Cooper demonstrated by sitting for approximately 4 seconds before abandoning the effort in favor of sniffing Nathan's boot. These were small things. Clara knew they were small things. She also knew they were not small at all. What? The offer came on a Tuesday in the second week of March, carried in from town by Bertha Colson, of all people, who had apparently appointed herself an informal messenger service between the Hale Ranch and the wider world. She arrived in the mid-morning with her husband on some other errand, and after the errand was concluded and her husband had gone back to the wagon, she lingered in the kitchen with the manner of someone who had a thing to say and was managing the timing of saying it. "There's a position," she said finally, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee. "At the Harlan's Creek Schoolhouse, Madeline Fraser is leaving in April. She's getting married, moving to her husband's family in Colorado. They need someone who can take the children through the end of the term and stay on for next year if it suits." Clara was at the stove. She didn't turn around immediately. "Why are you telling me?" "Because Frank Alderman mentioned your name to the school board last week, and they're interested." Bertha paused. "Room comes with it. Small house attached to the schoolhouse. Nothing grand, but it's yours. And wages. Real wages, not room and board." Clara turned then. Bertha was watching her with an expression that was difficult to read, not exactly sympathetic, not exactly calculating, somewhere between the two. "You could have a proper life in town," Bertha said. "Your own place, money in your pocket. You wouldn't be—" She stopped. "Dependent on someone else's household?" Clara said. "I was going to say, you wouldn't be so far out." "Bertha." Clara sat down across from her. "Why does this matter to you?" The older woman looked at her coffee cup. She turned it in her hands the way people did when they were trying to get at something honestly. "When I came out here the first time, I said something unkind about your appearance." She looked up. "I know I did, and you didn't argue back, which I respected, but I've been thinking about it since. You don't need to, I'm not asking for absolution," Bertha said, a little sharply. "I'm trying to do something useful. You've done good work out here. You've held this family together through a winter that would have broken things badly if you hadn't been here. And I think you should know you have options. That's all." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Have you mentioned this to Gideon?" "It's not Gideon's business. It affects his household. That's his problem to manage," Bertha said. "I'm talking to you." Clara looked out the kitchen window at the yard where the mud was losing its battle with the first determined shoots of grass. She thought about the schoolhouse. She thought about the attached house, small and hers, with wages she could save and a life that was organized around her own decisions. She thought about a lot of things sitting at that table. "I'll think about it," she said. Bertha nodded and finished her coffee and said goodbye, and the wagon pulled out of the yard and Clara sat at the kitchen table for a while after she was gone. She didn't tell anyone that day. She told herself she was still thinking, which was true, and that there was no point in raising something she hadn't decided about, which was also true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she didn't know how to raise it without it becoming something she wasn't ready for it to become. That evening, she went through her normal routine. Dinner, dishes, the mending that had accumulated during the busy days of the freeze's aftermath, the quiet hour in the kitchen after the children went to bed. Gideon was at the table with his accounts, as usual. He was working through the spring figures, the cost of the fence repair against the projected cattle sales, the math of a year that had taken more than it was supposed to. She watched him work without appearing to watch him. He had a habit when he was struggling with numbers he didn't like. He'd rub the back of his neck and set down his pen and look at the ceiling for a moment before picking it up again. He did this 3 times in the first hour. "Bad?" she said finally. He looked up. "Manageable. Not comfortable." He looked back at the papers. "The 2 heifers are the main problem. I can push the north fence repair to fall without catastrophic consequences, but it means the north pasture is risky again next winter." He paused. "Unless I don't use it next winter, move the north herd to the south pasture and let the north one rest." "Does the south pasture have enough capacity?" "Barely. I'd have to expand the water access." He did the neck-rubbing thing again. "Which costs money I don't quite have." Clara did the arithmetic of it in her head, the way she did most things. If the spring sales go as you're projecting, you'd have enough for the water access if you hold off on 2 of the other repairs. "Which 2? She told him. He listened, and then they went through it together, the way they had started to go through things. Not formally, not with any declaration that this was something they did, but naturally, because it worked. He knew the ranch's capabilities and limits in detail she didn't have. She knew how to calculate in a way that found efficiencies he sometimes missed because he was too close to it. By the end of the hour, they had a workable plan for spring. It wasn't what he'd wanted, and it meant deferring things that probably shouldn't be deferred. But it was real. He sat back and looked at what they'd worked out. "You're good at this," he said. "At arithmetic?" "At seeing the whole thing." He looked at her. "At looking at a problem and finding the path through it that doesn't cost more than you have." "I've had practice," she said. He picked up his coffee cup, which had been empty for a while. He looked at it and set it back down. Clara. Her name again. Direct. The way he'd used it in the cellar. "Something's on your mind tonight." She looked at him. "What makes you say that?" "You're quieter than usual," which is saying something. He wasn't being unkind. He was just saying what he saw the way he did. She folded the shirt she'd been mending. She set it down. "Bertha Colson told me this morning that there's a teaching position open at the Harlan's Creek Schoolhouse. Madeline Fraser is leaving in April." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "She thought you should know," Gideon said. He said it neutrally. "Yes." "Room comes with it?" "Small house attached to the schoolhouse." "And wages?" "Yes." He was quiet. He looked at his papers for a moment, then at his empty coffee cup, then at nothing in particular. She could see him working through it, the same methodical way he worked through everything, and she waited. "That's a good opportunity," he said finally. "I know. You'd have independence, your own place." He looked at the table. "You came here with nothing. You'd be leaving with—" "I'd be leaving," she said. "Just that." He looked up. Something in his face had shifted, though she couldn't have said precisely how. "Is that what you want?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "That's why I'm still thinking about it." He nodded. He looked down at his papers again and didn't say anything else that evening, and she went back to the mending and the fire burned down to coals, and eventually they both said goodnight and went to their separate rooms, and that was all that happened. But she lay on her bed in the small room off the kitchen and listened to the house settle in the early spring night and thought about the schoolhouse and the wages and the small house that would be hers. And then she thought about the kitchen and the cellar with its empty reserve shelves and May's handwriting on the chokecherry jam and Sam's fort made of firewood scraps, and Nathan straightening the dried bundle of greens because something in him had decided it was his to care for. She did not come to a conclusion that night. Dang, it was May who did it first, because May was always the one who did things by not doing them, who acted through the precise choice of what she said and when. 3 days after Bertha's visit, she came to Clara in the late afternoon while Clara was in the kitchen garden, beginning the preliminary work of turning the soil for spring planting. It was the kind of work that required physical engagement and not much thought, and Clara's mind had been running the same circuit it had been running for 3 days. Schoolhouse, wages, small house, independence, without arriving anywhere. May sat on the fence rail and watched her work. She did this sometimes, sat nearby without immediate purpose, and Clara had learned not to prompt her. She came to things at her own pace. After a while, May said, "Mama planted sweet peas along that south fence." Clara looked at the south fence. "I didn't know that." "They come back every year, from the roots." May looked at the fence with the expression Clara had come to recognize as May, looking at something that connected to something painful and deciding to look at it anyway. She said they were the one thing she planted purely because she wanted to, not because we needed them. But Clara set down her implement and straightened. Her back gave a small complaint about this, which she ignored. "That seems like a good reason to plant something." "She saved the seeds every fall," May said. "They're in the small jar in the pantry, the one with the red ribbon." She paused. She was going to plant a bigger patch last spring. She didn't get to. Clara looked at the south fence for a moment. "I found that jar," she said carefully. "I wasn't sure what was in it. I should have said something earlier." "May, you don't owe me. I know I don't owe you." The girl looked at her directly. "I want to plant them this spring. I want to put them along the south fence where she was going to put them. But I want to do it with you." She swallowed once. "If you're here." Clara held the girl's gaze. May was 9 years old, and she had just said the thing that all of them had been thinking and not saying, said it with the flat directness of someone who had decided that not saying it was its own kind of loss. "I'm thinking about it," Claire said. "I know." May looked at her hands. "I'm not trying to make you feel bad. I just—" She stopped. "When Mama died, nobody told us she was going to die until very close to the end. I kept thinking she was going to be fine. I kept thinking everything was going to be fine, and then it wasn't." She looked up. "I'd rather know the hard thing early than find out too late." Clara got up from where she'd been crouching and sat on the fence rail a few feet away from May. Her boots were muddy, and she probably should have done this differently, but there wasn't a better moment than this one. "I'll tell you what I know," she said, "which is that I haven't decided, and I won't decide without thinking about this." She gestured at the garden, the house, the whole of it, very carefully. "I'm not going to disappear on you. That's what I can promise right now." May looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded, once, with the gravity she brought to things that mattered. "Okay." She got off the fence rail and went back to the house, and Clara sat there for a few more minutes with her muddy boots and her unsettled mind, and looked at the south fence where the sweet peas were going to come back, whether anyone planted them or not, from roots that had been there since Ruth put them in. Sam did it differently, which was to say, he did it the way Sam did everything, in motion and without any apparent awareness that what he was doing was anything other than normal operations. He came to find her 2 days later while she was in the barn helping Nathan work on the saddle that needed restitching. He climbed up on the stall gate and hung there looking at them both with the particular energy of a child who had been thinking about something and had reached the point where the thinking needed to come out. "Nathan says you might go live in town," he said. Nathan, without looking up from the saddle, said, "I said she might, not that she was." "Are you?" Sam asked Clara. "I'm thinking about it," Clara said. She had started saying this to everyone, and it was still true, but it was getting harder to say. Sam appeared to give this serious consideration. "Would you take Cooper?" "Cooper is your dog." "Okay, but if you took him, I wouldn't be as sad about the other part." He seemed to recognize this was not a fully worked-out position and adjusted. "I mean, I'd still be sad, but I'd also be worried about Cooper." He swung a little on the gate, processing. "If you go, who's going to make the bread the way you make it?" "Anyone can learn to make bread, Sam." "Nathan burned it last time." That was one time, Nathan said, in a tone suggesting this was a matter of some sensitivity. It was burned. I was watching something else. You were watching a hawk. It was a big hawk. Clara looked at Nathan, who was 15 going on 40 when he wanted to be, and 12 going on 8 when he didn't. He was not looking at her, focused on the saddle stitching with great attention, but she could see the set of his jaw, which was his father's jaw and carried the same careful, controlled quality. She waited. He pulled the thread through and set the saddle down for a moment and looked at it critically. "The schoolhouse job," he said, without looking at her. "You'd be good at that." "I think so," she said honestly. "May would probably come and see you." He picked up the saddle again. "She'd find a reason. She's like that." A pause. "And I'd need to come into town for supplies sometimes. It wouldn't be—" He stopped. He started over. "It wouldn't be like never seeing you again or something." "No," Clara said. "It wouldn't." He worked for another minute in silence, then, "But it would be different." "Yes," she said. "It would." Sam, who had been following this exchange with the focused attention of someone watching a very slow game, said, "I vote no." "It's not a vote," Nathan said. "Everything's a vote. Miss Clara taught me that." He looked at Clara. "You said when a family makes a decision, everyone should have a say." "I said everyone should be heard," Clara said. "That's different from a vote." "Well, I want to be heard then." He straightened up on the gate with the posture of someone making an official statement. "I want you to stay. That's what I want to say." Clara looked at him. The small, serious face, the boots that were still slightly too big, the dog-shaped absence beside him that meant Cooper was somewhere nearby being unreliable about staying put. She looked at Nathan, who had gone back to the saddle stitching with the careful attention of a boy who had said what he was going to say and was done. She looked at the barn around her, the smell of hay and horses, the winter light coming in through the gaps in the boards, the repaired fence post in the yard visible through the open door. She had a decision to make. She had not made it yet, but it was getting clearer. Gideon found her in the evening, which was where he usually found her. In the kitchen, in the lamp-lit quiet of the house, after the children were in bed. He came in from checking the barn and poured himself coffee and stood at the counter for a moment, not sitting down, which was different from his usual. She was mending something, but she put it down. He turned around and looked at her with the expression of a man who had spent several days deciding whether to say something and had finally come down on the side of saying it. He looked uncomfortable, which was honest, because he was. He was not a man who said things he hadn't thought through carefully first, and this had the quality of something that had been thought through a great deal, but still didn't sit easy. "I need to say something," he said, "and I'm not going to say it well, so I'm asking you ahead of time to hear what I mean, not just what I say." Clara folded her hands in her lap. "All right." He stayed where he was, not sitting, as if sitting would have made it too settled a thing. "When Alderman brought you out here, I thought I was doing you a favor. I think I've already said that." He looked at his coffee cup. "What I didn't say is that I also thought you were going to leave. That's what happened with the others. They'd come out, stay a few weeks, and the isolation or the work or something would be too much and they'd go." He set the coffee cup down. "I didn't let myself think of you as permanent because I didn't want to be wrong again." Clara looked at him. He was not looking at her still, looking at somewhere between the counter and the table. "And now you have a real choice," he said. "The schoolhouse job is good. You'd be foolish not to consider it, and you're not a foolish person." He paused. "But I need to say this before you decide, because I'll spend a long time thinking about what I didn't say if I don't." He looked up then, directly. "I don't want you to go," he said. "Not because of the household, not because of what you do around here. Because of—" He stopped and started over. "You're the most capable person I've met in a long time. You see things other people miss and you don't make a performance out of it. You care about my children in a way that's real, not like you're trying to fill a role, and I—" He looked at the table again, then back at her. "I want you here. Not as a housekeeper. Not as whatever arrangement Alderman and I worked out when you first came. I want you to stay because you want to be here, not because you don't have somewhere else to go." The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at him for a long time. She was thinking about all of it. The schoolhouse, the wages, the small house, the independent life she'd been building toward in her mind since she stepped off that train and got left on the platform. She was thinking about Bertha's voice across the kitchen table. You could have a proper life in town. She was thinking about everything she'd believed about what her life needed to look like. She was also thinking about May's handwriting on the choke cherry jam, Sam's boots, too big, growing into them, Nathan fixing the fence post properly and not saying he was doing her a favor, the cellar, and what it had held and what it had meant to build it. She was thinking about this man in front of her, who was standing in his own kitchen looking uncomfortable and honest in equal measure, who had just said, "I want you here," without any decoration, and was now waiting. She was not a person who made decisions from sentiment. She never had been. Sentiment was something you felt after you'd worked the problem out, not a reason to skip the working. She'd been working the problem for 5 days. "I'm not going to pretend I haven't thought about the schoolhouse seriously," she said. "I have. It's a good position, and I'd be good at it." "I know," he said. "And I think if I'd been offered it in October when I first got here, I would have taken it." He nodded. He was watching her carefully. "But I'm not in October anymore," she said. "And neither is this household." She looked at him steadily. "I need to ask you something directly." "All right. What are you asking me?" "Exactly. Because there's a difference between asking me to stay in my room off the kitchen and asking me something else, and I need to know which one you mean." He met her eyes. He didn't look away. "Something else," he said. "That's going to be complicated," she said. "We haven't known each other very long. The children are still—" "I know all of that," he said. "I'm not asking you to decide everything tonight. I'm asking you to stay. The rest of it can work itself out if you're here." She looked at him. He looked back. She thought about how things worked themselves out in her experience, which was not smoothly and not according to plan, and not without disagreement, and not without the occasional Tuesday when everything seemed harder than it should be. She thought about how that was true of anything worth doing. "The sweet peas along the south fence," she said. He blinked. "What?" "May wants to plant them. Ruth's sweet peas. She wants to put them where Ruth was going to put them, and she wants to do it with me." Clara paused. "I think I need to be here for that." Something happened in Gideon's face. A small, controlled thing. The kind of reaction that ran deep and didn't make it all the way to the surface, but almost. He looked at the table for a moment. "Yeah," he said when he looked up. "You do." She nodded. She picked up the mending again, which was something her hands did when a decision had been made, and her mind could let go of it. "I'll write to the school board in the morning," she said. "I'll tell them I'm not available." Gideon stood for a moment longer, looking like a man who had expected this to be harder and wasn't sure what to do with the fact that it hadn't been. Then he picked up his coffee cup. "All right," he said. He sat down at the table and opened his accounts, which was his way of settling back into himself. She worked on the mending. The fire burned down the way it always did, and the house made its ordinary sounds. After a while he said, without looking up, "I burned the bread once, when I was learning. I burned it 3 times, actually, but the children only know about the once." Clara looked up from the mending. "Nathan burns it looking at hawks." "That sounds right. Sam told everyone. Sam always does." She went back to the mending and didn't say anything else, and he went back to his accounts, and the lamp burned between them on the table. And outside the spring night moved across the open land with something in it that was almost warm. Not quite, but almost. The sweet peas were going to need the full south fence, Clara thought. Ruth had been planning a bigger patch. She'd want to do it right. She started making the plan in her head the way she made all plans, quietly, methodically, from the ground up. The sweet peas came up in April. Not all at once. Nothing on that land did anything all at once, which Clara had come to understand was part of its character rather than a failing. They came up in the tentative, testing way of seeds that had been waiting through a hard winter, a few green shoots along the south fence one morning, a few more the next, until by the middle of the month there was a thin but definite line of growth running the full length of the fence the way Ruth had planned it. May checked on them every morning before breakfast. She didn't make a production of it. She just went out, looked, came back in. But Clara noticed, and Gideon noticed, and even Nathan, who was 12, and had recently decided that noticing things was a kind of vulnerability to be managed, noticed, because Nathan noticed everything and just chose what to do with it carefully. "They're going to flower purple," May said at breakfast one morning in late April. "Mamas always did." Most sweet peas do, Clara said, though some go pink. Hers were purple. May said it with finality, the way she said things she had decided were settled. I remember. Then purple it is, Clara said, and that was the end of it. It was around this time that the question of Clara's actual status in the household began to become a thing that other people had opinions about. The ranch was not an island. Neighbors came and went, people talked in town, and Bertha Colson had apparently mentioned to at least 3 people that the arrangement at the Hale place had evolved beyond its original terms. In Harlan's Creek, where there were enough people that nothing was entirely private and few enough that everything was somebody's business, this was the kind of development that generated commentary. Gideon was aware of it. Clara was aware of it. They had in the way of 2 people who communicated well about practical things and carefully about personal ones, not yet directly discussed what to do about it. What they had done was spend 3 months moving from the arrangement they'd had to something that didn't have a clean name but had its own shape. He had started deferring to her on household decisions without framing it as deference, just asking her opinion and then following it when it made sense, which was most of the time. She had started asking him things about the ranch operation that went beyond what the kitchen needed to know, because the more she understood about the whole of it, the better she could do her part, and also because she was genuinely interested in how the land worked and how a cattle operation ran against the seasons. They had arguments, small ones, twice, about things that weren't really about what they seemed to be about, the way arguments in households never were, and worked through them with the mutual stubbornness of 2 people who were too practical to stay wrong when they didn't have to be. It wasn't a romance, exactly, in the way stories describe those things. It was something more durable than that and less convenient, the way real things usually were. The first trip to town together came in early May, when the spring supplies needed picking up, and Gideon had a meeting with the land office about the title on the north pasture, a piece of paperwork that had been pending since the previous fall and needed resolution before the summer grazing season. All 4 of them went. This was not a planned statement. It was simply that Sam needed new boots because his feet had finally caught up to the ones he'd been growing into, and May wanted to go to the dry goods store, and Nathan had earned the trip by virtue of a solid spring's work that Gideon had acknowledged with the particular quiet sincerity that Nathan responded to better than any amount of praise. Clara wore the better of her 2 dresses, which was not dramatic but was what she had, and she put her hair up properly for the first time in months, and when she came out of her room, Gideon looked at her with an expression she'd gotten used to reading, a man who noticed things he didn't always say. "You look well," he said. "Thank you," she said. "You have mud on your boot." He looked down. He did. He went and fixed it. Sam declared from his wagon seat that this was the best day so far this year, a judgment he issued regularly about various days and which appeared to be entirely sincere each time. Nathan sat beside his brother with the posture of someone who was not going to say this was the best day of the year because he was 12 and therefore above that, but whose expression suggested he did not entirely disagree. The road into Harlan's Creek had dried out from the spring mud, and the drive took 40 minutes, which Sam filled with an account of Cooper's recent activities that was detailed enough to constitute a biography. May sat in the back with Clara and watched the land go by with her usual quiet attention, and once, without any particular preamble, reached over and took Clara's hand briefly and then let go. The way children did things they didn't want to talk about. Clara let it happen and didn't mention it. Harlan's Creek on a May morning was more alive than it had been when Clara arrived in the fall. More people on the main street, more wagons, the energy of a town that had gotten through a hard winter and was now doing what frontier towns did in the spring, which was push forward with renewed argument and commerce. The general store had new stock in the window. The land office had a line of 3 men waiting outside it. The saloon at the far end of the street was already managing customers at mid-morning, which said something about something. Gideon took the wagon to the livery and went to his meeting at the land office. Nathan went with him. Clara took May and Sam to the dry goods store, which was Sam's least favorite destination because it did not, in his assessment, contain anything interesting, but which he tolerated because Clara had mentioned the possibility of peppermint candy if the morning went reasonably. The dry goods store was managed by a woman named Dorothea Park, who was approximately 70 years old and had seen everything and forgot nothing and organized her store with a precision that Clara respected. She greeted Clara with the warmth of someone who had heard enough about her to form an opinion and had formed a favorable one. "The Hale children," Dorothea said, looking at May and Sam with the assessment of a woman who had known their mother. "May, you're getting tall. Sam," she looked at his feet. "Lord, those boots." "I need new ones," Sam confirmed. "My feet grew a lot." "They did," Clara said. "We need to look at boots." They spent a comfortable 20 minutes in the store, Sam trying on boots with the gravity of someone making a serious equipment decision, May selecting thread in specific colors that Clara didn't ask about because May's choices in such things were always considered and usually right. Clara picked up the supplies on her list and settled with Dorothea, who wrapped everything efficiently and made one quiet comment as she did so. "It's good to see you looking settled," she said to Clara. "When Frank Alderman first told me about you, a young woman stuck in town with 40 cents to her name, I worried." "I was fine," Clara said. "You were not fine," Dorothea said pleasantly. "But you are now, which is what matters." Clara looked at her for a moment. "Did everyone in this town know I had 43 cents? 43? I heard 40, Dorothea smiled. "Small town." Sam appeared at Clara's elbow with boots on his feet that fit. "These ones," he said. "Those ones," Clara agreed. But they were coming out of the dry goods store, Sam in his new boots and testing them against the boardwalk with exploratory stomps, when Clara saw Thomas Greer. He was coming out of the land office, which was 2 buildings down, and he was not looking in their direction. He looked the same as he had on the platform in the fall, broad through the shoulders, the deliberate walk of a man who considered himself to have his affairs in order. He had, she'd heard from Bertha at some point during the winter, taken on a housekeeper from back east who was apparently more to his physical specifications, and who was, according to Bertha, neither happier nor unhappier than the arrangement deserved. May saw him at the same moment Clara did. May's hand, which had been at her side, came up briefly as if she was going to reach for Clara's, and then she stopped herself. 12 going on 30, always doing her own calculations. Thomas Greer turned because the street was not wide and they were in it, and he saw Clara. She watched him recognize her. It took a moment. That was the first thing. There was a beat of blankness, the face of a man encountering someone familiar who wasn't immediately placing them, and then it resolved. And she watched him work through it, watched the recognition, then the association, then the particular recalibration of a man realizing that the woman he had left on the platform in the fall looked nothing like the woman standing in front of him now. She hadn't thought about this moment. She'd had other things to think about. But standing in it, she found she felt almost nothing, which was more interesting to her than feeling something dramatic would have been. She had come a long way from that platform in a direction that had nothing to do with Thomas Greer, and the distance showed in both directions. He nodded at her, a tentative courtesy. "Miss Whitlock." "Mr. Greer," she said. He looked at May and Sam, and then looked at the general shape of her. The dress, the way she stood, the quality of someone who was not stranded and not waiting. And she could see him doing arithmetic he hadn't expected to be doing. "You're—" He seemed to be searching for the word. "You're still in Harlan's Creek." "I'm at the Hale Ranch," she said. "I have been since September." He nodded slowly. Something in his expression was uncomfortable, though he was managing it. "I heard they had someone helping out." "They do," she said simply. Sam looked up at Thomas Greer with the frank assessment of a 5-year-old and said, "Do you know Clara?" "We've met," Thomas said. "She lives with us," Sam said. "She made the cellar reserves that saved us in the winter, and she fixed the fence post the right way." He seemed to feel this was an adequate summary of Clara's relevant accomplishments and looked back down at his boots. Thomas Greer looked at Clara. She looked back at him. She didn't feel triumph, which had been the thing she'd half expected if she ever found herself in this position. She felt something closer to clarity, the clean, uncomplicated recognition of a woman who had ended up exactly where she was supposed to be, though not by the route anyone had planned. "It seems you've done well," Thomas said. He said it with the particular discomfort of a man who has made a decision he can't quite call wrong because it led to where he is, but who can feel the outline of what he passed over? "I have," she said. That was all. There was nothing else that needed saying. She put her hand on Sam's shoulder and steered him down the boardwalk toward the livery, and May fell in beside her, and she heard Thomas Greer's footsteps going in the other direction, and the town moved around them in its ordinary way. May, after about half a block, said quietly, "Was that him, the man from the train?" Clara looked down at her. "Yes." May thought about this for a few steps. "He didn't look like much." "No," Clara said. "He didn't, but—" Gideon was at the livery when they arrived, the land office business apparently concluded, standing with Nathan and looking at something in the paddock with the focused expression of a man who had just gotten good news and was deciding whether to trust it. He looked up when they came through the gate. "How'd it go?" Clara asked. "Title's clear," he said. "North Pasture's ours without the encumbrance question. The surveying error from 5 years ago is corrected." He said it in his flat, matter-of-fact way, but she could hear what was underneath it. The relief of a man who had been carrying a legal uncertainty on top of everything else for longer than he'd mentioned. "That's significant," she said. "It means I can run full capacity next winter without the liability question hanging over it." He looked at her. "It changes the spring numbers." "I know," she said. "I was thinking about that." Nathan looked between them, the way he'd been looking between them for months, with the careful attention of an oldest child running continuous background calculations. Sam showed his father the new boots, demonstrating their soundness by stomping experimentally on the livery floor. May handed Gideon the thread she'd selected, which he received without questioning why he was now holding thread, because he had learned that May's decisions in such things had logic he'd come to trust. They were loading the wagon when Gideon said, low enough that it was just for her, "I saw Greer in the street, coming out of the land office." "So did I," Clara said. He looked at her. "You all right?" She thought about the moment on the boardwalk, the blankness before recognition, the recalibration, the discomfort she'd watched move across Thomas Greer's face. She thought about Sam's boots and May's thread, and the new boots and the cleared land title, and the sweet peas coming up purple along the south fence. "Yes," she said. She meant it completely. He held her gaze for a moment, and then nodded and went back to the loading, and that was that. It was Bertha Colson who made it formal, in the way that things in small towns became formal, not through any official declaration, but through a public moment that everyone present understood as a line being drawn. They had lunch at the boarding house that served as Harlan's Creek's closest approximation of a dining establishment, which was a long room with 4 tables and a woman named Agnes who cooked whatever she had and charged what she felt like charging and tolerated no complaints, and which was full on a May midday with ranchers and merchants and their families. Bertha was there with her husband, and she waved them over to the larger table with the authority of a woman who considered the social arrangements of the room to be partially her responsibility. They sat, all 5 of them, Clara and Gideon and the 3 children, in the arrangement that they'd fallen into so gradually that none of them had noticed it becoming an arrangement. Bertha looked at Clara across the table. She looked at the children. She looked at Gideon. She had the expression of a woman confirming something she had already concluded. "You look like a family," she said. She said it matter-of-factly, not as a compliment exactly, but as an observation, the kind you made when you were simply reporting what you saw. The table was quiet for a moment. Sam said, "We are a family." Nobody corrected him. Gideon looked at Clara. She looked at him. It was the kind of moment that accumulated rather than arrived. Every morning in the kitchen, every evening at the table with the lamp burning between them, every problem worked through and every silence that didn't need filling. You couldn't point to when it had happened because it had been happening all along, one small decision at a time, the way most real things built themselves. "We are," Gideon said. He said it to Bertha, but he was looking at Clara when he said it. Agnes arrived with food and the moment settled into lunch, which was ordinary and loud and involved Sam spilling his water and Nathan catching the cup before it fully tipped, and May handing him a cloth with the timing of someone who had seen this before, which she had. Bertha's husband talked to Gideon about fence line logistics. Bertha talked to Clara about the spring planting and what she'd heard about the summer being dry and whether Clara had considered expanding the kitchen garden, which Clara had in fact been considering and had thoughts about. Across the room, a man Clara didn't know caught Gideon's eye and nodded with the kind of nod that acknowledged something without saying it. Gideon nodded back. Small town, small gestures, things understood without being stated. Clara ate her full portion, which she had been doing since May made her promise to, and drank her coffee, and listened to the table around her with the particular attention she gave to things she wanted to remember. They drove home in the late afternoon, the road golden with the particular light that came off that country in May when the angle was right, and everything seemed to have more depth than usual. Sam fell asleep against Nathan's arm, which Nathan tolerated with a patience that was itself a kind of love, the grudging, real kind that didn't make a production of itself. May sat beside Clara in the back of the wagon and leaned her head against Clara's shoulder somewhere around the 3-mile mark, not saying anything, just being there. Clara looked out at the land going past, the wide grass, the fence lines, the occasional stand of trees following a creek bed, the hills to the west that were purple in the late light. She had come through this country for the first time in September with nothing, sitting beside a sheriff she'd just met on the way to a house full of strangers. She had looked at it then and felt its size, the way it made everything feel exposed and possible at the same time. It still made her feel that way. That hadn't changed. What had changed was that the exposed part didn't feel dangerous anymore. It felt like hers. Gideon drove without talking, which was his way on the long drives. She watched his hands on the reins from the back of the wagon, the easy, practiced handling of a man who had done this 10,000 times. She thought about the north pasture and the cleared title and what that meant for the spring numbers. She thought about the south fence and the sweet peas. She thought about the bread recipe she'd been adjusting, trying to get it where she wanted it, which was a project that was going to take most of the summer. She thought about the things she hadn't been able to give herself for a long time because she'd been spending everything she had on staying upright. There was a conversation she and Gideon had never quite completed, the one that had started in the kitchen when he asked her to stay. Not because they were avoiding it, but because it was the kind of conversation that didn't happen all at once. It happened in pieces. A decision here, a morning there, the accumulation of days that were building something without announcing what they were building. He finished it in June. She was in the kitchen garden when he came out and stood at the fence line the way he did sometimes, not interrupting her work, just present. She kept working and waited. "I talked to Frank Alderman this week," he said. She looked up. "About?" "About what you'd need, legally, to have standing in the household." He said it with the careful practicality of a man who understood that naming things directly was the honest way and had decided to be honest. "He gave me some information." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He looked back. "I'm not asking you to decide today," he said. "I know we said the rest of it could work itself out. I'm not trying to rush that." He paused. "But I want you to know I've been thinking about it seriously, about what's right. For you, not just for the household." She looked at him for a long moment. He was standing at the fence with his hat in his hands, which he did when he was being careful about something, turning it slightly. He was not a man who performed sincerity. He was just sincere, which was both easier and harder to deal with than the performance would have been. "I know you have," she said. "I can't promise it'll be easy," he said. "I'm not easy to live with when the cattle numbers are bad. I work too much in spring, and I go quiet in winter, and I have a 12-year-old who thinks he knows everything and a 5-year-old who actually might." "I know all of this," she said. "I'm saying it anyway, because I want you to know what you're choosing if you're choosing it, not just the good parts." She got up from the garden bed and came to the fence and stood on the other side of it from him. "Gideon?" She said his name the way he sometimes said hers, directly, with no decoration. "I watched you lose 2 heifers in a freeze and not fall apart. I watched you realize your son needed to hear you say he did good work, and then say it. I watched you sit at that table every night with the accounts that were bad and not lie about how bad they were." She paused. "I'm not choosing you because I don't know what I'm choosing. I'm choosing you because I do." He looked at her across the fence for a moment. Then he opened the gate, which was the practical thing to do given that they were standing on opposite sides of it, and came through it. And she stayed where she was, and they were close enough now that the conversation was different. "All right," he said quietly. "All right," she said. It was not a dramatic moment. There was mud on her garden gloves, and he still had his hat in his hands. And somewhere from the direction of the barn, Sam's voice was audible, explaining something at length to Cooper. But the undramatic quality of it was exactly right, because that was what their whole story had been. Not grand gestures, but small ones. Not declarations, but the slow accumulation of days where two people showed up and did the work and didn't leave. They were married in July at the ranch because neither of them wanted the production of a church in town. Bertha Colson organized a celebration afterward with the authority of a woman who considered herself partly responsible for the whole development, which she was. Alderman came and shook Gideon's hand and looked at Clara with the expression of a man reviewing a decision he'd made in September and finding it held up. May wore a dress she and Clara had made together over 2 weeks in June, working on it in the evenings at the kitchen table, and she had put sweet peas from the south fence in her hair, purple ones, the same as her mother's had always been. She had stood very still while Clara pinned them in, her face doing its careful private work, and Clara had let her have that. The complicated thing, the grief and the sweetness of it coexisting without resolution. Because some things didn't resolve, and the only honest response was to hold them both. Nathan had been the one who stood up when Alderman asked who present could attest to the character of the parties involved, a question that was part of the frontier ceremony they were using. He stood up with the careful deliberateness of a 12-year-old making a statement he had thought through and was prepared to defend, and he said, "I can," and sat back down. It was the most that needed saying. Sam cried briefly, from happiness, and then denied he had done this when May pointed it out. And the denial was so unconvincing that Nathan laughed, which was a sound they didn't hear often enough, and which made Gideon look at his oldest son with an expression that was worth a great deal. What? What Clara understood by the end of it was something she couldn't have put into words on the platform in September when she'd stood there with 43 cents and nowhere to go. She understood it now the way you understood things that took time to become clear. Not as a lesson that could be stated neatly, but as a truth you arrived at through the actual experience of living. She had spent most of her life being seen as someone fragile. The thin girl. The mill girl. The one who looked like a strong wind would take her. She had spent so much energy proving that wrong that she had sometimes confused, proving it wrong with the actual life underneath. The life that wasn't about proving anything to anyone. That was just about paying attention and doing the work and staying when it mattered. What she had found on this ranch, in this particular winter, with these specific people, was something she couldn't have engineered and couldn't have predicted. She had shown up with the wrong expectations and the wrong transportation and no money and been left on a platform by a man who saw her surface and decided it was the whole of her. And then she had walked off that platform and found, through no particular plan and a great deal of accidental competence, that the life she was supposed to have was not one she could have drawn a map to. You didn't find it by knowing where you were going. You found it by paying attention to where you were. She had paid attention to the sky that told her what weather was coming, to the children who told her what they needed in every way except directly, to the man who worked too hard and went quiet in winter and said things plainly when he finally said them, to the land itself, which was indifferent and enormous and also, somehow, hers. She hadn't arrived at any of this by being strong. She'd arrived at it by being honest about what was in front of her and doing something about it, day after day, even when she was tired, even when she was hungry, even when the outcome wasn't clear. That was what she knew by the end. In August, when the sweet peas along the south fence had bloomed fully, and the summer had done the dry thing it had threatened to do, and the garden had required more work than usual for that reason, Clara stood at the kitchen window in the early morning and looked out at the yard the way she had gotten in the habit of doing, looking north at the sky, checking the weather, reading the land the way she'd learned to read it. May came in behind her in her two big slippers that were slightly less too big than they'd been in January, and stood beside her and looked out the window too. "They're going to go to seed soon," May said. "The sweet peas." "We should let them," Claire said. "Save the seeds the way she did." May nodded. She was quiet for a moment. "She used to stand at this window," she said. "Same time of morning." "I know," Claire said, looking north. "I know." May looked up at her. "I think she would have liked you," she said. It came out considered and specific, the way May said things she had been thinking about for a while. "Not because you're trying to be what she was, because you're not." Clara looked at the girl beside her. The serious face, the dark eyes that had her father's quality of directness in them, the growing ease of a child who had come through something hard and was finding her way out the other side. "Thank you," she said. "That matters to me." May looked back out the window. The morning light was coming up over the eastern fence, and the sweet peas were moving slightly in the early wind, and the yard was beginning to make its daily sounds. The horses, the cattle in the distance, Cooper somewhere performing his morning patrol with great self-importance. In a few minutes, Sam would appear at a run. Nathan would come in from the early barn check. Gideon would be in from the south pasture by 7 and would want coffee and would sit at the table and look at the week's accounts, and she would sit across from him and they would work through whatever needed working through, the way they did. The bread was rising on the counter. The garden needed water this morning because August was doing what Bertha had predicted. There was mending, there was always mending. There was the fence on the east side that Nathan had flagged as needing attention and that she'd been meaning to ask Gideon to look at. There were 100 things, as there always were. She turned from the window and pushed her sleeves up and went to start the day. The sweet peas would seed themselves, and they would save those seeds, and next spring they would plant the whole south fence again. A bigger patch, the way Ruth had planned, the way things got carried forward by the people who remembered them. Not perfectly, not without loss, but carried forward. That was enough. Most days, it was more than enough. The fire needed tending and the bread needed watching, and somewhere outside, Sam's voice had already begun its morning narration of events as they unfolded, which meant the day had properly started, and Clara had work to do, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be.